A chilling story that will have you wondering, was it love or money? It was an exotic honeymoon that came to a horrifying end 100 feet beneath the ocean's waves. A scuba dive goes terribly wrong. The newlywed bride lifeless on the ocean floor. The groom on the surface, calling for help or guilty of murder. Here's ABC's Elizabeth Vargas for our series, Crime and Punishment.
This home video of a happy newlywed couple packing for their honeymoon in Australia is one of the last images of Tina Watson alive. Their fairy tale wedding behind them, they set off to go diving in the Great Barrier Reef.
She was very excited about her wedding. She always wanted to be the princess bride. She wanted everything just perfect. She had it planned out perfectly.
But 11 days later, Tina was dead. Now, Gabe Watson stands trial in an Alabama courtroom accused of murdering her, with Tina's parents front and center in their quest to find out what really happened to their daughter.
This is about getting justice for our daughter.
Prosecutors began the trial this week by showing jurors this photo of Tina lying lifeless on the ocean floor. As shown in this Australian police reenactment video, the prosecution believes Watson killed his new bride by turning off her air supply on her scuba tank and then holding her in a bear hug while she suffocated. They say he then turned the air back on, which is how it was found, all in under 6 minutes. The defense argues that scenario is impossible and that Tina's death is a tragic accident.
Two inexperienced divers. And a perfect storm, a culmination of bad facts and bad circumstances.
I could tell at that point, she was scared before it, but at that point I could tell that, she was frightened.
Today in court, the jury watched a tape of Australian police questioning Gabe about the dive. Gabe says Tina struggled to swim in the strong currents and that she began to sink in the deep water. He says he signaled to her to inflate her buoyancy vest to help her stay afloat, but that she couldn't. He then took her hand and tried to pull her along.
Her hand hit my mask. It knocked my mask sideways. So I had to let go.
Gabe then says he made a fateful decision to go up to the surface to get help for Tina.
In that split-second decision that he made underwater, at 45, 50 feet of water, with a current in his face, and his wife sinking away from him, he made that decision to go for safety and go for help up on the surface. That decision has been second-guessed for 9 years.
But prosecutors say Gabe Watson has done more than second-guess his actions that day. They say he's changed his story about what happened several times.
The fact he keeps changing his story, the fact that he's lying.
They argue he planned to kill his new wife, also he could collect on her life insurance policy.
The defendant expected to gain up to $165,000 from Parisian's death benefits.
But it wasn't Gabe who was the beneficiary on Tina's policy, it was Tina's father. Gabe Watson never received a dime. There had been tension between Gabe and Tina's family even before their wedding. They thought Gabe was cool and controlling of their daughter.
I don't think that Tina's mother thought that this was the right guy for her.
Since Tina's death, those tensions have become an all-out war between Gabe and Tina's family. Tina's father fought to have Watson charged with murder in Australia. Gabe Watson did ultimately plead guilty to negligent manslaughter.
Well, the manslaughter standard that he pled guilty to is a very obscure Australian law that says that if you undertake a dangerous activity with someone, you have a significant responsibility to make sure that they're safe. Not that he killed her, but he didn't do enough to save her.
After spending 18 months behind bars in Australia, Watson returned home, only to face murder charges again.
The state has to show that the defendant caused her death by drowning, that the defendant acted intentionally in causing that death.
Australian journalist and seasoned diver Peter Patrick has been following the case for years. He says there is evidence Gabe's story of what happened could be true, that Tina could have panicked on this deep and difficult dive.
She shouldn't have been diving in that depth of water for her first ocean. I mean, this was the very first time she'd been diving in the ocean, and she chose what's really a fairly significant diving event.
Gabe and Tina were attempting what's called a drift dive over a century-old shipwreck. Currents are so strong, divers are told not to fight them, but instead to drift over the submerged ship Patrick has done the dive himself.
It wasn't a Formula One dive, but it was a good run around the racetrack where you needed a lot of skills and you needed to be prepared.
She had just learned how to scuba in an Alabama pond, where her instructor said she also suffered a panic attack even in those calm waters. Divers use more air when they are fighting currents to swim, or when they are panicking. Tina's tank showed she had consumed an unusually high amount of air.
I think the evidence at the trial will be consistent with panic and consistent with Gabe's story.
The dive organizers on the reef that day were found guilty of negligence and paid a fine for violating their own safety procedures by letting a novice diver go unescorted into the water. Gabe's defense lawyers say that didn't seem to matter to police. They were so convinced of Gabe's guilt early on, they turned what they saw as his unemotional response into evidence of murder.
When he returned to Alabama, he met with grief counselors. He attended a young widow and widowers group, a support group. He grieved. He couldn't date. He couldn't interact socially. He was numb, and it took years for him to heal. And he's still emotional when he discusses it.
Two starkly different portraits of Gabe Watson are now on display. Stunned, grieving widower, or a calculating killer who left his new wife dying on the ocean floor. 12 jurors will soon be asked to decide. I'm Elizabeth Vargas for Nightline in New York.